I've had a request for a tutorial for making this. This is my Gnome Christmas topper, which I've shown you before. It is a very basic pattern. It's just some very basic blocks, and it goes together very, very fast. I don't usually do tutorials for things, but I thought I'd give this one a try because it's such an easy project. So what are you going to need for this project? Well, you'll need a center square that unfinished, measures 8.5 inches. And this is what I put my embroidery on. Now, I'm not going to show you how to embroider in this video because all embroidery machines and methods are slightly different. But you should have a piece of fabric in your hoop. I cut mine about 12.5 inches square. That gave me lots of room to hold it well within the hoop and also for squaring it up. After the design was printed, I put a ruler on it and lined it up, centered this image in the center of the ruler and cut it at 8.5 inches square. Okay, trimmed it up. So you need one of those. That's your foundation piece. Then you're going to need a square. You're going to be making 4 flying geese, and the method I'm going to show you works with this particular ruler, which is called the Ultimate Flying Geese tool. It's by Creative Grids. I use this a lot for flying geese, and it works very, very well. I'm going to show you how to use it during this little video. But you'll need one of those for my method. There are other methods where you can make flying geese. You don't need that ruler. It's up to you, whatever you're most comfortable with. But the measurements, if you're using the ruler, you'll need a square, which is your geese, your goose, basically. And that piece should be, I'm just looking at my notes, you need 9 3/4 inches square. And then you need 4 5 1/4 inch squares to make the wings, whatever color you're going to do with that. And so if you look at my example, you can see my flying geese. So the big square is the one that's most prominent, and then the 2 little gray with the white snowflakes are, I don't know, the sky, the wings. I'm never sure which parts of these, what they're called. Okay, so you, as I said, you need you need 4 of those at 5 1/4 inches square each. Then you need the corner pieces, and you'll need 4 of those cut at 4.5 inches each. So those are all your component parts for this project. Okay, now I didn't include in that the borders or the binding or the backing. That's pretty much evident, and it's up to you what you want to do with borders. For me, I just cut strips, 2 strips, 2 inches with the fabric for these gray borders up here. Okay? All right, so in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to assemble this block. The first thing you want to do is make your flying geese. So I'm going to move my camera down so you can see my work table. I hope you can see that. Okay, and you're going to need that 9 3/4 inch square of fabric. Lay that down, and then take 2 of the 5 1/4 inch squares, and you're going to place one up here in the top left hand corner and line up the edges on 2 sides. Now if they don't line up exactly, that's okay, but get them as close as you can because these are designed for cutting down and squaring up. And then the second 5 1/4 inch square goes into the bottom right corner. Again, trying to line it up and trying to keep this point fairly in line with the point up here. Now you're going to take a ruler and a pencil or a marking tool of your choice, and you're going to draw a line from corner to corner diagonally. Now this is too short. This ruler needs something a little longer. There we go. So from point to point, and just take a look at that square that's here, and you can line that up a little bit. It might overhang slightly over the edge of the larger square, but that's okay. And then draw a light line with your marking tool. right down the diagonal. Now it's probably a good idea to take some pins before you go any further and just stick these in to hold everything in place. And keep them far enough away from the drawn line so that you can leave them in as you sew. Okay, now I'm going to take it over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of this line, and I'll show you that. So I'm at my sewing machine and I want to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of that line that I just drew on here. So I'm placing it under my foot, making sure my 1/4 inch is there, and I'm using an F foot, an open toe foot, and I've got a little red arrow here so I know exactly where my line is, but remember I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch away from that line. And we're just going right down the middle. And you do want to take your time with this because you want to keep those squares laying nice and flat, and we've used the pins to keep them exactly where we want them on this larger piece of fabric. Okay, so we're coming to the end. So we'll just finish. Now, if you're doing a bunch of these, you could chain stitch this way, no problem at all, but I'm only making one, and this, as I said, will give me 4 flying geese, which is exactly what I need for this table topper. So again, I'm just following that center line and doing 1/4 of an inch stitch line from it. Yes, I know I could speed up the sewing machine, but for this purpose, I'm not. This speed is just fine for me. Okay. Cut my thread. And then I'm going over to my cutting mat and show you what to do next. Okay, so I'm on my cutting mat, and I'm taking a ruler, and I'm going to line that up right along. And actually, I think before I do that, I'm just going to take my pins out because they're making my ruler unsteady, and I'm just going to line that ruler up right along that drawn line, and I'm going to cut along the drawn line. So now I've got 2 pieces. Now what I want to do is take this over to my cutting, or not my cutting, but my pressing mat, and I'm going to press each of these back just like this. And now I'm just giving it a light finger press at the moment, but I am going to take it over to my iron and press both of these. So that's what I'll do right now. I know you can't see this, but I'll show you what this looks like. Now you don't want to give it any steam if you can avoid that, because these are cut now on the biased, and of course they'll stretch, but this is what you're going to have. Let me do the other one. Okay, so we have both of those pieces now done. Now what you want to do next is take your other 2 5 1/4 inch squares, and I'll just move this one out of the way so you can see this a little better. Lay them right side down, or pretty side down. Take a couple of pins again and just secure the piece. And draw a line, I think I'll use my shorter ruler, from diagonally across the square, or from point to point. Now I'm going to do that to the other piece as well, but then I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine, and I'm going to do exactly what I did last time. I'm going to sew 1/4 inch straight line, stitch line down on either side of that line, and I'm going to do it to both pieces. So again, I'll show you. Put the square here. Again, line up the edges as close as you can, but keeping in mind you want that point pretty much in the center. If it's off by a little bit, it's not going to matter because these are being made very generous in size for trimming, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So again, secure it with pins, and I'm using these magic pins and I really like them. And draw my line. And now I can take these over to the sewing machine. Okay, so I'm over at the sewing machine again. I'm just going to take one set of these to start with and do exactly what I did the last time, following that line, 1/4 of an inch stitch line on either side of it. Now, since I have 2 pieces I have to do this way, this is where I can do some chain stitching. So we'll come to the end of this, and rather than cut my thread, I'm just going to lift my presser foot, pull a little of that through, and put my next piece on and do it again. And cut my thread. And now I'm just going to flip these 2 pieces around and I'm going to sew on the other side of the line just as I did. So I don't think I need to show you that. So join me now back at the cutting mat. Okay, so I'm back at the cutting mat and I have my 2 pieces. So first thing I want to do is take my pins out of both pieces. And then we're going to take a ruler, line it up along that marked line, and cut. And I'm going to do the same to the other piece. And this is how we get 4 flying geese out of those pieces. Okay, now I'm going to take these over to my pressing mat, and I'm just going to press back each one of these just as I'm showing you here. Again, I'm going to try to avoid using any steam because I don't want to stretch my pieces. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll be back to show you what's happening next. Now, I have my flying geese all pressed, but these are not the right size. We want these as unfinished pieces to be a 4.5 by 8.5, and they're not that yet. And this is where our little ultimate flying geese ruler comes in handy. Now, I know it's probably not very visible on here, but down this side there is a guide to the size of flying geese that you want to create. So in my case, I want to create finished size 4 by 8. So it tells me I needed a big square, 9 3/4 inches, and 4 smaller squares, 5 1/4 inches, which I've already gone over. So let's just take this to the side. We're going to put flying geese this way, and there is a trim 1 and a trim 2. And next to that 4 by 8 is the letter H. So I look for the letter H inscribed on this ruler, and there's a dotted line, and I put the point of that dotted line into the point of my flying geese. And I make sure the lines on either side are lined up. Now, will this always match up exactly? Well, it depends on many factors, but you can eyeball it. In like, if it's not going to line up exactly along your seam lines, and I'm really lucky because they are, then I just sort of center it, keeping that point at the top of the point that's created by these 2 wing pieces. Once I have that lined up, I'm going to trim 2 sides of it, the right side and the top. Now you may be only taking off a little slither, because you see here, that's all I've done. And then what you want to do is turn this 180 degrees go to the ruler part that says trim number 2, find your H, which will now be at the bottom. The V will be pointing to the bottom. And do the same thing. Line that point up with the point on your piece. Line up the dotted lines right along the edges of the goose. Now it may be out a little bit. You can manipulate your fabric so things line up. There's a little bit of stretch because this is cut on the bias, and that's okay. When you have it all lined up, you're going to trim off the right side and the top again. And now you have a perfect 4.5 by 8.5, sorry, a 4, let me get it right, let me just measuring here. Yeah, 4.5 by 8.5 flying goose, which when put into the block will become 4 by 8. Okay, I'm going to do exactly what I just did now to the other 3 pieces, and then I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine again. Okay, so I've taken my pieces and I've laid them out on a small design board, and I've put it so that you can see it upright. This is backwards to me, but you see the big ones in the center. We have a flying geese with the points in towards the center on all 4 sides of that block, and that gives you our star, and then the corner pieces up here again. So now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and start putting my rows together. Okay, I'm back at the sewing machine, and I'm going to start assembling the block. So I'm just going to take my first two pieces in the row, and just as a reminder, this is the way the first row would go together. So I'm going to just flip this over and line up that corner piece with the flying goose. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've got my 1/4 inch foot in the machine. Okay, now I'm going to put the end block on. You can't get your orientation at this point mixed up because it doesn't matter whether the point's up or down when you're putting on these end pieces, because it's the same either way. No, and I just ran, nope, I got to rethread. No, it looks good to me. I think it's lying to me. It was. Does that sometimes. Okay, so this is row 1 done. Let's just cut that thread. And so I would take this over to my iron and I would press my seams, because this is row 1, press them to the left on both of these sides. So that takes us next to the big piece in the center. And essentially I'm making sure, now orientation is important here, I'm going to make sure my point is going in, and it is. And some people might want to put the flying goose on top and sew it that way. And actually, that's a really good reason, a good idea, because if you do it this way, you'll be able to see your point, and you don't want to lose your points. So I'm just lining this up here. And if it looks like your needle's coming too close in the allowance to that point and it's going to cut it off, you can just shift over a little bit. So let's try this and see how we do. Now I'm just stopping here to see where that needle's going to come, and I think it's going to be okay, but I'm just going to shift it just slightly, just a scant, the width of a thread over as I go through there, and there we are. So yes, there's some fudging involved here. It's just a slight bit, but that will make sure that your point does not get cut off in the seam allowance. Let's see if I did this right. Yes, I did. I have a good point right there. Okay, so I'm just going to flip this around. And I'm going to take the other piece and make sure my point's going towards the center square. Flip that over. And in this case, I don't have to flip the whole piece over because of this orientation. I can see exactly where my point is here. And I'm going to do the same thing here as I did the last one. I'm going to watch closely to see where that needle is going to come down. And I just make sure it just misses that point. And when I open this up, I should have a perfect point, and I do. So on this piece, when I press it, I'll be pressing towards the right side. And the idea here is that then when I put the rows together, my intersections are going to interlock. So now I'm going to take the last row, bottom piece, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to sew this one. Again, orientation at this point for this piece does not really matter. And the last piece for this row. You can see that this can go together very fast. And so what I'll do if I'm making multiples of this is I will cut all my pieces out first and then do it in assembly line approach. Okay, cut the thread, open this up, and this time I'm going to press again towards the left so that my intersection pieces will lock together. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to press it, and then I'll come back and show you how I put the rows together. Okay, so I have my pieces pressed, and I pressed this piece towards the left and this one towards the right, and now I want to put my rows together. So I'm going to take the top row, lay it on top of the middle row, and I'm going to take some of my wonder clips, and I'm going to line up these intersection points, and they should nest into each other very neatly because the seams are going in the opposite direction, and that's what we mean by nesting. And believe me, it is worth the effort to press them in the correct order because you're going to get nice, neat intersection points. And I'm just putting a few extra wonder clips in here to keep everything secure. You could use pins if you wish. Okay, I've got this piece, and I'm going to go over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance along there. Again, I'm going to be aware of my point right here, the intersection of the threads. I want to make sure I'm just a thread's width away from that point. Otherwise, I will chop off my point. Okay, I will show you what that looks like in a second. So I've got the first row sewn on, and I've done my seam pressing. I pressed the seams towards the top. At this point, it doesn't really matter because there aren't any other intersection points that we're going to have to be matching up for this particular block. But if there were, then you'd want to plan ahead to which way you want to press your seam allowance so that your pieces will interlock. Now I'm going to put the bottom piece on, and I'm just going to flip it over. I'm going to spin this whole thing around and show you again that I'm lining up the intersection points, putting on a clip, Now if you have a little bit of fabric hanging over the edge, don't worry about it because you'll square this up afterwards. You may just take that little sliver off and that's fine. Okay, I'm going to take it over, sew it, and press it, and come back. So I've got it all pressed, and I've changed its orientation so you can see it the way I would normally be looking at it. Now for me it's in reverse, but if you'll notice, all of the points of my flying geese are all there. They're not cut off. That's because I was very careful when I sewed the 1/4 inch seam allowance that I didn't go over where the two stitch lines intersect. And you'll notice that all my intersecting points all match up perfectly. Again, that was because I clipped it. You could pin it, whatever works for you. So there, essentially, the block is now done. I do need to add the 2-inch borders around this, but I'm not going to show you that because I think you will pretty much know how to do that. Or maybe I will show you. Well, let's see. Now, I've cut some border pieces, and what these are 2-inch strips with the fabric, and then I cut those in half so I get 4 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to put 2 aside, and I'm going to concentrate on the side pieces first. And of course there's more than enough here, and that's fine because I like to even it up after I've sewn it on. So I'm just going to take this for one side. I'm going to lay this out, and I'm going over both edges. Now I could line it up so if this is cut straight, and it is, I'll line it up with this straight edge here, but you could have it overhang and then cut it off if you're not sure about how straight things are. I'm going to take some Wonder Clips. Now there aren't any intersections here I have to worry about, which is fine. This is just straight 1/4 inch seam allowance sewing to put this border on. But the reason I'm using the clips is it just keeps things nice and straight and from separating from each other when I'm sewing them on. And at the same time, since this is a small piece, I'm just going to go to the opposite side and do the same thing. That way I don't have to be getting up and down from my sewing machine as often if it's already pre-clipped or pinned. Just carefully lining up the edges. I am sure you know exactly what I'm doing because this isn't anything that's earth-shattering. Okay, I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this edge and a 1/4 inch down here, and then I'm going to take it over to my pressing mat. I'm going to press each one out, and then I'll put the next 2 on and do the same thing as I did here, and then trim it all up and show you what it looks like at that point. And so there we have it. I've got my borders on now, so this block is now done in terms of the top. I still need to, let's bring the original in, I would still need to put on my batting and my backing, quilt it in whatever method that you want to do, and I just did a simple wavy line with my walking foot, and I did do some free motion in here, just echoed the embroidery in the center, and then put your binding on and you're done. Now you don't have to put a binding on it. You could do this as a flip and fold or whatever they call that, blanket, bagging it out, envelope mode, whatever, if you don't want to bother with the binding. But I think the binding finishes it off very nicely. So that's all there is to creating this really nice little table topper using your, actually you can use scraps and some embroidery, and it's going to make a nice little Christmas gift, I think. So thanks for watching.